Hello, and welcome to the Secret Tree of Alchemy, the episode for the Cancer trump cards, Fortune, and the Chariot, and this is part 3. Today, I thought I would focus on certain core issues associated with memory encoding, specifically long-term memory encoding, how it relates to Cancer and the alchemy presented in the cards. Alchemy tends to take advantage of certain aspects of how the human mind and brain work together, to encode memory as one thing. But also in how the brain functions in everyday living, survival-wise, from an evolved perspective, and in thriving, which is what human beings are particularly good at. The mnemonic Q is going to be brought up as an issue central in this process because it is central in alchemy, And to relate story around that concept, I'm going to use one of the common metaphors associated with this particular sign and these particular trump cards. And that, of course, is the idea of an intelligence vehicle as it finds itself conceptually grounded realistically in terms of something like a caravan type vehicle drawn by horses, or the automobile as we've come to experience it over the past century of its development as a technology and an industry and a culture. So, as one example of how the concept of intelligence vehicle and motor vehicle show up in relation to this particular astrological sign, there's one modern tarot deck that's been issued, probably not in print now, where they actually use a Formula One race car to illustrate ideas associated with the Chariot trump card as a Cancer analogy, a motorized vehicle that requires a great deal of intelligence and logistical support to keep running efficiently enough to win races and become, champion in doing so, right? To win championships. So the idea of being a champion is kind of central in these cards too, the form of the Sphinx in Fortune, and the knightly figure that is typically seen in the Chariot, the various versions of the Chariot, right? And that follows right in line with certain other symbolic cues or mnemonic cues that you find in the Chariot, such as the Golden Road concept, right? Similar to what you see in versions of the Moon, for example, the Rider-Waite deck, where there's a golden road, right? So in Crowley's version of the Tarot, this golden road shows up in the Chariot in the form of what look like gold bricks, somehow comparatively shadowy and dark compared with other symbolism in the Tarot. So that being said, I guess we should just dive into the symbolism here, right? Summa cum laude. So the Golden Road also shows up in the Chariot, but also in Fortune in the form of the armor in the Chariot. It's gold colored, right? You could even say it's made of gold, but that would emphasize funerary ritual, basically. But in Fortune, it shows up as, the lightning bolts combined together with the golden spokes on the wheel of Fortune there. It's kind of a golden rope for all three figures in that card. The Sphinx kind of being on the top, facing in an opposite direction compared with the two students at the feet of the Sphinx, so to speak, right? The more simian-looking student, you might say, or developing faculty, having some question-asking capability, right, in the face of the Sphinx. And the stars also, one of which is penetrated by the sword, the air elemental sword. Accessing an object or an objective. It can be in the form of a book, for example. But also any other mental focus which reveals information by various means to an individual. And of course, you got a star right in the center of the spokes for the wheel and the Fortune also, which is kind of a golden road analogy. The idea of being a golden road means it takes you someplace pinnacle in life or peak experiential. And Tarot, that would be symbolized by the Hermit and the Magus or the Magician trumps. Okay, the various versions of those trump cards. Now, they touch upon, symbolic cues that date back at least as far as ancient Egypt, if not, ancient Babylonia or whatever, or ancient Sumeria. But certainly ancient Egypt as kind of a pivotal point in human history as far as, our development on a technological level. Born largely of necessity. For example, the Great Pyramid was developed out of a kind of a necessity, with the other great pyramids being kind of like symbolic after effects to that development. This having to do with an expected famine, right? How does the Pharaoh keep grain under the Pharaoh's hand, according to Moses, right? Well, you develop a technology for that that's militarily reliable and effectively reliable, minimizing the number of people required to secure the place on a military level. A pyramid, a big stone pyramid, happens to be perfect for that, especially when located, in the nearby desert. Designed in such a fashion to even minimize the need for keeping cats around to deal with the mouse problem, right? Or the rat problem, which might exist to some degree out in the desert. Certainly mice adapt themselves rather well to those environments. So we've got a lot of cat symbolism going on here, certainly in the case of the Sphinx. But a human head has been placed on top of the cat, symbolized by an installation into the pyramid while it's being built around the grain elevator function, right? Thus we find out a lot of the design features of the pyramid, which might seem superfluous for a fully developed pyramid, existed for reasons of practical value prior to the full weight of the pyramid coming to bear on the design, right? For a while, it was a grain elevator made of stone and secured by walled fortifications around it, with a big stone front door that swiveled on a central pivot, right? Allowing access into the pyramid that could be controlled militarily, right? Big pits, big rectangular pits dug around the pyramids for grain storage. At least 7 years worth of grain, right? Plus whatever they managed to stuff initially into the grain silo aspect of this big stone structure, which is in the process of being built over the course of 2 decades, right? So in the end, it becomes a big riddle. What was this place for? And there's all kinds of mnemonic cues to the effect that might bring about an understanding as to what the place was for, because ancient peoples understood the value of mnemonic cues. It's basically what an astrological sign is. It's a mnemonic cue that brings up certain related information to mind, to be related in the form of algorithmic sequence or priorities of work if you're getting into procedural considerations, okay, which means you're going to be practicing things to learn them, right? Mathematics and statistics being two examples, where practice becomes particularly important compared with, other forms of learning, which also come to bear in both of those disciplines, by the way. Conceptual learning, where mind maps become particularly valuable, but also, drawing together all these ideas, right, is the way the mind works with analogy, right? Working with analogous concepts, kind of anchored into the mind's memory matrix via mnemonic cues, which are basically signs. An astrological sign is a mnemonic cue. In ancient times, if you were, for example, forced into becoming nomadic, via foreign invasion or whatever, you still had your signs to take with you, and you could draw them in the dirt. Astrological signs, runes, other types of symbols like the swastika could be drawn in the dirt, and then as soon as you do that, people of learned background can then relate story form, or algorithm form teachings, right? Which the brain, the mind, happens to be evolved to take advantage of as far as learning is concerned, right? So this idea of caravan becomes important here. When you're forced to become nomadic, you must work out all the issues associated with transportation, which become every bit as important as, maintaining a house, as discussed in previous versions of this episode. Okay, the part 1 and part 2, where I emphasized house. Okay. Sometimes these adaptations turn out to be harmful in the case of the binding of infants, for example, which resulted in the development of technologies associated with the binding of the skull, which produced severe forms of neurosis along with characteristic skull forms of a pointed nature, right? And sometimes rather large due to inflammation influences, right, brought to bear illness-wise upon the individuals suffering from this. Okay, binding of infants, swaddling of infants in place with bindings and what have you, especially those around the skull, had an influence in making people neurotic. But that was a technological adaptation that was employed to facilitate becoming nomadic and moving everything caravan-wise to another location, right? Dragging along your belongings on carts that, didn't even have wheels, but were basically saplings being dragged along. You cut all the branches off and then you put boards across it and then you bind all your belongings on there, to include swaddling and, swaddle binding your infants to the contraption and then dragging it all along, right? If you didn't, bind the skull, the infant's head would flop around and the infant would wind up dead from that, right? Or severely damaged, so debilitated, which is of no use survival-wise for the clan or the tribe or whatever that's moving along into a new form of life. But they also have other technologies they bring along, to include pneumatic cue technologies, which is where you get a lot of this abstract symbolism associated with alchemy, surviving into modern times through tarot symbolism and astrological symbolism. And it is interesting that these symbols all map out a certain way in the form of the secret tree of alchemy, of which there are derivative symbol systems of inferior nature that were developed. Secret tree of alchemy, of course, is astrological. Okay. But every symbol system of truth finds application in this particular map. So, of course, a map is used for traveling purposes, right? So we're right back into this golden road symbolism we've been talking about here. And there's, tribal ways of symbolizing these processes associated with Cancer, particularly in the form of dance, right? Ancient Native Americans developed forms of expression having to do with dancing in conjunction with drum beats, right? Making it an intelligence symbol, but particularly Cancer symbolic versions of it that could be, applied or categorized, I should say, under this sign would involve dances that look like crystal balls, right? Where the dancers are very close together, kind of dancing very close together such that, you'll see a face appear for a time and then disappear back into the dance, almost like the way penguins survive the winters, right? In Antarctica by rotating in and out of a tightly knit group, to face the cold and then go back to the center of the group again to become warm again, and then on it goes all winter long. That's like a crystal ball dance. This symbolizes how memory matrix formations preserve themselves in the face of the harshness of the universe, the larger universe, right? Your memories take care of each other. There's a certain kind of social inclusion associated with memory maintenance that I like to call closure development, where the Gemini aspect of your mind produces a kind of integrity that manifests in Cancerian form, astrological form, in the form of like a set of memories or a matrix that maintains itself, and certain aspects of it are maintained out of the illumination of Gemini. The infinite set, the functional infinite set of Gemini, you might say, where all the Cartesian coordinate systems derive their power of ultimate placement, okay, as typically defined in the form of a finite set or a set with finite properties associated with it that I've described earlier in the presentations, the parts to this episode. Gemini provides this kind of integrity by effectively grouping similar ideas together as related to each other, right? So this is where analogy and the power of analogy comes to bear on these systems, right? So once you got a group of memories kind of clustered together as a chunk, it's known as a chunk of memory, this becomes part of a collective integrity in Cancer. That's also referred to, in my view, as a collective expression of unity. Thus, you have a functional unit of some kind initially organized in the form of, in mathematical terms, you call it a set. There are defining parameters to a given set used in mathematics that ultimately define the scope of operations of a function as it works through a mathematical equation to produce effectively some kind of function of calculative nature, right? That you get into pretty deeply in something like calculus. The domain and range of a set basically sets up what you call active providential parameters for this. Once the set is emptied, you might have something in place, functionally speaking, that starts the whole process over again or simply stops the process. This is where you're getting into computer programming, okay, and related algorithmic design, right? But the mind is continually trying to maintain this integrity, this baseline integrity, in conjunction with, the health of the human body and the brain and its mind, right? Whether you believe in monism or mind-body dualism like Descartes did, these ideas, both of them are never going to go away. But science prefers monism because it's observed monism in action, whereas mind-body dualism relies more on metaphysical considerations as a sourcing, a context or a meta or whatever for its considerations on practical grounds, right? These practical grounds, of course, tend to organize themselves golden. Thus, you get golden road analogy here, right? The maintenance of health and development towards peak experiences as integral with that health, where there's a certain amount of satisfaction derived out of living life. That's relatively free of the influence of depression. If you think of depression as a Capricorn analogy, as associated with waste energies and related inefficiencies in how nature integrates that aspect of reality in with everything else, right? That's healthy. Cancer is very central to human health. You might say it's a baseline for human health, along with such concepts as trust, care, home, safe place, related activities of a relatively serene and tranquil nature. If they're efficient activities, the tranquil aspect is less marked as far as conscious experience goes, compared with something like, a destructive cult would impose upon you, where the trancy aspects of it might be particularly marked to the point where they are seductive. This isn't to say conscious experience of trance is bad, but it might be associated with less efficient processes of mentation, associated quite often with destructive cultism. It's important to remember I very often speak in relative terms here. So I tend not to speak in black and white absolutes as much as productive expressions of gray, okay? So this idea of being golden is important to this card, becoming golden a certain way. This has to do with what I call the development of closure, which you could think of as the same idea as building a house or an intelligence vehicle of some kind, some other kind, analogous to a baseline process and related set. The process being more implied at this point, as a set would provide provisional parameters within which a function would operate. It's almost like this is a gas tank, the primordial gas tank here that you would install into a motor vehicle. It's got a certain amount of capacity. The vehicle requires a certain fuel to operate, maybe high test fuel because of high compression, in the motor, relatively speaking, the engine. Less of an important as the technology developed through the early part of the 21st century, but still quite important as a consideration, as fuel today is of lower octane, typically, without lead, right? Some of the stuff they were producing for World War II was just loaded with lead, the P-51 Mustang having to operate on those fuels to produce, power out of that's relatively small 12-cylinder engine, right? Compared with what the Germans were working with, 94-octane high-test fuels, which required a little bit bigger an airplane engine, flipped upside down in some of their designs, right? To find room for the thing in the relatively small aircraft. Quite effective, both designs, but the Western design won out in the end, right? The industry supported The winner is better on a provisional level, similar to what I'm discussing here, right? Logistical level. One of the first things that breaks down when you're losing a war is logistical processes. And this is something propaganda can take advantage of on multiple fronts to produce propaganda taken into the Cold War and into the cultural realm via Holocaust hoax propaganda, right? So, yeah, logistical breakdowns can be taken advantage of by an enemy. So we got a military angle to all this symbolism taking place here. Even the Sphinx has kind of an armored headdress, armored to the front, you know. But in Greek mythology, the Sphinx shows up with breasts to symbolize something they understood probably about the ancient Egyptians and their Great Pyramid, right? So, golden road, making yourself golden. Okay, this is where your mind is taking experiences, right? Grouping them together, for example, with traumatic experiences in order to make even those experiences over time golden and valuable to be maintained as part of your learning process. So, though it makes sense to do everything right that you practice in life, right? Things practiced wrong or traumas that took place don't equate to the end of the world, though it takes time to recover from these things because new learning has to take place, right? New learning, of course, becomes relatively more accessible compared with older learning, kind of in a chronological manner, right? Accessibility-wise. And you can learn to work in priming chunks of memory into relative accessibility of a greater degree compared with older learning that you're not presently entertaining in your behavior. So, for example, if you practice something wrong in the past, you can always just pick up the ball again and practice it right. And the new learning will replace the old learning. And the more you practice, the more it replaces the old learning. And the more chunks of memory that are associated with the right practice will become primed into relative accessibility as far as recollection is concerned. For example, procedural recollection, revealing itself in your behavior very spontaneously, typically, if it's automatic, right? Born of automaticity, right? So in a sense, you're building a momentum here that shows up not only in your fashion of wear, which is styled a certain way that you'd call Virgo or golden, but also in the road you're maintaining in life, which is golden, like in The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy chooses to walk a golden road versus the red road, which takes you where exactly? The red road? Basically nowhere, or Aries, right? Pure oblivion, ultimately, I suppose. Incorrect practices will eventually maybe kill you. If you're not doing things as efficiently, for example, as you could be, you could die from that. All right? Which is a relative oblivion, depending on what you think in terms of in regards to reincarnation possibilities, right? And various different manifestations of reincarnation that take place, including some which arise out of oblivion of Aries into the manifest perplexion of Capricorn, right? Which can take on a certain seductive air and also a mysterious air all its own. That's, it's not that much different from a crocodile rising out of the depths from a deep sleep that was going on for like 45 solid minutes, and the thing just surfaces to breathe. And there it is in the water, and it's evaluating the shore, right? Automatically. Part of its automaticity, right? Which is symbolized in fortune in the form of this crocodile-like god, which seems to be particularly, shall we say, hung up. This coming out of hanged man status. The Hanged Man being an Aries symbol along with the Emperor, right? Those two trump cards. But in a sense, it becomes, shall we say, the devil, this croc figure, right? As symbolized by the devil trump card in Capricorn. You don't know what this creature is about unless you are learned enough to know what that creature is about as it's surfaced out in the water. Maybe, you could use that as a symbolic expression of, now I want to learn something over there on that shore, which is maybe the local university, or I don't want to take classes now. And maybe you're a bit perplexed as to how to go about doing that, so you decide to sleep on it some more. So you go down for 45 more minutes and kind of sleep on it for a while. Then you wake up after 45 minutes, typical gator sleep time. 30 to 45 minutes, who knows? They're all down there sleeping in the dark together, the gators or the crocs down, hidden in the depths of the river delta or whatever, right? Or the river, the waterway, the brown water. So you surface again, and now you've got some obsession running that, you're managing properly enough for it to be appropriate to maintaining goal stability towards getting into that university over there and learning some things, right? Digesting some things, you might say. Digesting material for, maintaining your own mind map / constitutional, mental constitution in life for some practical value purpose or another, right? Usually professional. But it's so perplexing, this idea of going to school and trying to learn, trying to become a student, right? So you're still kind of hung up, which is symbolized here, right, by the croc god. But over time, you're traveling along that golden road, maybe hung up on a rung. You're starting to actively climb or progress towards pinnacle experience, where the Sphinx is up there experiencing some kind of pinnacle experience as the professor, right? They're experiencing the life of the university campus from that perspective, up there on the top of the world, so to speak, right? Maybe even they have achieved tenure doing so. But as a student, you're much more properly attired for school, fitting in with all the other students, right? With your hair properly maintained there, somewhat still simian in your orientation in life, right? As symbolized by this monkey god creature here. This is tying the idea of ideation in with that of spirits. Symbolism in these cards, right? These are spirits. Spirited expressions, but they're also realistic expressions, which ties the idea of the spirit world in with the idea of how the mind and its physiological counterpart, the brain, maintain ideation for themselves, right? So spirits care for each other in this environment, right? You'd call a university or a universe, right? A college. They've got colleges on that university campuses, which are kind of like solar systems, right? So this monkey creature is learning how to be a student, for one thing, which means this monkey creature is learning practical methodologies associated with studying and learning, many of which are available studying psychology. But also you can find them, as expressed by students on the various video platforms where they publish, right? Where they talk about how they became good students. Much of the information is valuable. Some of it is dangerous, in my view, especially speed reading related stuff, where, it seems to me like they're trying to turn off parts of their brain in order to access more information, right? Where, small parts of what they're presenting have value. Like, for example, how to read more efficiently using certain methods. But it's not a good idea to do some of those methods, right? Where you no longer, fully register what you're reading verbally, for example, and your mental recitation that's ongoing when you're reading. Your brain actually makes use of that to learn. In fact, even verbal recitation has its value. For example, when you're privately safe place located with your flashcards, your 3x5 cards or maybe 5x7 cards, right? And you're rehearsing, okay, to learn reference material or definitions, right? Or working with the type of material that's akin to that which is used in rather than deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, where you're working with something that's more like direct evidence, right? There's a certain amount of running ideas through your head over and over and over again to get them down enough, learned as concepts, right? Flashcards over and over and over again. Rehearsed, maybe verbally spoken with the voice box to work the Broca area of your brain along with your Wernicke area of your brain, which are involved in linguistic, logical, and sequential processes, right? So, the left side of your brain works along those lines quite a bit. So eventually, you start to formulate, again, a mind map where analogy starts to reveal itself as an influence, right? And certain concepts are naturally mapped out that way as you're taking notes, right? So on the one hand, you're taking notes, producing at least flashcards in a manner very similar to the coded notation used in dictionaries, right? It pays to learn that code system for that particular codex, right? That system of notation for writing flashcards because it's efficient and you could fit a little bit more information onto a flashcard or even into a notebook where you just wrote down a definition. You use the same kind of mnemonic cues that are used in a dictionary to save space and, of course, learn that language. It's a useful style of writing for certain things, right? But eventually you're going to be mapping things out in your mind, and there's a certain way of organizing a map in relatively abstract terms where there are signs associated with it, right? Sometimes you're using the signs that are coded into the notation of writing dictionaries. Sometimes you're using symbolism borrowed from mathematics where, for example, maybe you just wrote down an example out of the textbook in relatively efficient terms that you would call summarized or paraphrased into summarization, right? To save space and make it so your mind can look at a page of notes like a mind map, right? So you write your example over to the left side. And over to the right side, you write out an explanation of the example. And you use notation similar to what is done in mathematics in describing the steps involved in solving a problem. You've got numbers inside parentheses for each step, reserved for that specific kind of expression on a page of notes, right? Mathematical coding or notation can be used for other purposes, mainly the organization of your notes. You know, you come to use those signs as mnemonic cues, which automatically say to you, this is an explanation of something, a step-by-step explanation. To the left, you've got your notation that you typically use for examples and related signs to make things more efficient, kind of over to the left. Above there, you've got your definition written out associated with that, or an axiom, or an explanation of a theory, a theoretical presentation, or maybe a step-by-step expression of a specific process, procedure. A procedural orientation is revealed there that uses specific notation to express that, right? And then, of course, that implies the idea that you have to practice the procedure, right? A certain kind of rehearsal associated with that. That ties in with other kinds of rehearsal involving maybe flashcards. So your mind's automatically relating all these things together, especially if you organize your notes a certain way, to where you're not writing page after page after page, like 5 pages for every single page of textbook information you're accessing, but maybe you're doing an efficient job of reading a paragraph or a section of a chapter, and then paraphrasing each paragraph, and then after paraphrasing it, summarizing each paragraph systematically to force your brain to learn the material, right? You can't paraphrase and then summarize unless you're learning the material, right? And then afterwards, you go back and check your work by reading the paragraph or section again, right? So that you've got 2 reads in on a given section of your textbook, right? At least 2. Plus, you've gone over your notes at least twice. And then after the fact, go through your notes again and read them. Leave space in your notes for class notes, and maybe even, use different color ink for class notes, maybe blue-black, because the class is live, right? So you leave space for class notes, and you got your notes taken, and you studied pretty extensively prior to class, so you're prepared for class. It's easier to follow what's being stated in class without falling asleep, right? Because when people get perplexed, they get sleepy too. They become semi-woke, you might say, or they become woke. A version of woke, because they become kind of sluggish and perplexed, maybe sleepy on top of it all, but also emotionally reactive, because you're looking at things up on the chalkboard you don't understand, right? Because you didn't study ahead of time for class. So you're not getting everything out of class you could get if you did a good, efficient job of studying the night before. And the thing to remember with learning along these lines, your brain continues to learn something you just learned for like 6 hours after the fact due to physiological processes that take place in your brain, and also memory consolidation processes that take place that involve the limbic system. Motivation becomes important, right? Enthusiasm becomes important, and communications going on between that part of your brain and your cerebral cortex, where memory is ultimately encoded in specific parts of that, right? Having to do with learning. Fear learning, for example, part of the cerebral cortex. Kind of in the area of the premotor cortex and the frontal lobe area down at the bottom of your brain. That's strongly associated with learning things and learning new things on top of other things, right? Of course, another important consideration is as you are learning, you are gaining understanding, okay? So that is typically quite often symbolized in the trump cards, understanding, all right? In comparison, the other cards like the typically familial knights or kings or queens or princes or princesses, okay, those people are typically involved in something or another, totally caught up in being involved, right, in the symbolism of the tarot in comparison. And of course, the numbered cards typically relate mundane, everyday situations encountered, right, in life. But the trump cards are a lot about various forms of understanding achieved. Thus, they are spiritualized presentations of symbolism, relatively abstract symbolism usually, but practically grounded in a manner that relates strong ideation. Okay, thus they are spirited expressions, right? So this typically shows up in tarot cards where something is at the feet of the central figure in the cards, right? And what is central is usually some kind of process, thus it's ritualistic presentation going on here. Either this amethyst bowl or this golden spoked wheel that you see in Fortune. And the color, amethyst or purple being expressed here. And various different guises symbolizing tempered ritual activity. okay, at various levels of consideration that you would call holographic analogous, okay. Holographic analogy at work, holotrophically, holographically in presentation, relatively speaking, symbolic terminology of relating to that idea, of course. Analogy is particularly important in that because analogy is something that gets lost up into Gemini, where specific placement is only suggested possibility-wise, ultimately expressing itself specifically in Sagittarius down below, right, where things are, where understanding is gained. And once you have understanding, you've gained Virgo status on the top of the hill, right, where you got that 360-degree perspective on things, right? Like a Route 66 sign on a highway with its two eyes and its eyebrows kind of looking at you while you're on the road there. You're being watched by something, right, on the Route 66. 666. That's a big mystery associated with the symbolism of Route 66. It's become a cultural icon, even though the road itself is golden and watching. For some strange reason, you might say, gone from existence, except as a tourist attraction down in the southwestern part of the United States. The route wears a royal crown of a sort, right? The state, or I think it's the, what do they call it? The interstate route? Yeah, it's interstate, so it's federal somehow. So the federal government is watching you, symbolically speaking, by these road signs, especially Route 66, which looks kind of like a crowned owl out on the road that you're passing by. And it symbolically probably shows up indirectly in some of those mysterious old black and white movies where people are out on the road as ghosts. They've just been killed and they don't realize it, and they're following a road towards what exactly? Maybe in a relative oblivion, but also a certain kind of awareness that produces reincarnation, right? Where you realize finally that you died in your past life, right? So here we've got wheel and fashion made analogous, and then we got the bowl symbolized by all this purple sloshing about of ether in the fortune card, right? They're analogous to each other. Statically expressed as sapphires. Yeah, and then, of course, you got the cape shaped like a bowl. And that all happens to be kind of organized the way a motor vehicle is organized, right? You got the red lights to the back. That's the red surface to the back of the cape. And then you got the white surface to the front. Purity of purpose, symbolized by the headlights, illuminating things in front of your car as you go down the highway. And, you know, somehow the highway provides for you relative absolution too, because there are lights shining on other vehicles. Brake lights that come on, backup lights that come on, that sort of thing, helping you along with your absolving what's going on the road, right, as you travel. You put in your own effort from your end, and it seems like nature provides from its end of things, right? Absolution. So you can see things on the road in absolute terms, or in clear terms, or clearly illuminated terms, right? But then, of course, you know, there is the dissonance factor, which you could call karma, negative karma, right? A reaction from the universe in response to your presence, especially your conscious presence, which tends to attract karma, right? All right. And karma is really just basically the universe saying, this is you for now, for the moment, in the moment, maybe. So Capricorn symbolizes manifest dissonance, right? So that would imply that Cancer expresses a certain kind of universal harmony in comparison, right? As a collective unity that operates somehow in opposite terms from the absolutely and completely singular unity of Aries, right? Which also symbolizes pure oblivion that you can't experience consciously, but it is part of the providential you could call them natures or metaphysics, that ultimately provide for manifest reality that you would call physics, right? So Gemini is largely part of metaphysics because you can't experience it. And you can't nail it down experimentally either or ritualistically, but you can extrapolate up into that area of consideration via conceptualization of metaphysical nature born of physical nature. Okay? So physics becomes a means of extrapolating conceptually into metaphysical considerations. That's kind of going on with the Sphinx here. The bottom, beneath his nose is in the physical world, but his head's getting up into the metaphysical considerations that you call Gemini or the magic mirror, and kind of trying to discern how it works, though placement is relative up there differently compared with in reality. Okay, because we can't place relative placement in Gemini we can't place it in realistic terms or visual terms or auditory terms, sensation terms of any kind, really. And sense, along these lines, are important considerations in dealing with reality, but also form the basis upon which extrapolations begin into metaphysical considerations, systematically speaking, right? So we can get up into considerations of Gemini level, which is active providence, Taurus as the initiation of active providence. Both of these, strongly metaphysical, but discernible through intuition and the emotions, right? Most strongly. The quiet voice that, passes you some literature, serendipitously, right, in life, synchronistically. You can discern up into those areas through that. And then there is the pure metaphysics of Aries, pure oblivion, pure singularity as an expression of some kind of unity, but not really an expression, just a consideration, as that which expresses itself does so in nature, right? Everything you discern is discerned in the perception, which is part of nature. Okay? And centering yourself there in perceived nature tends to center your perception scientifically, where things can be discerned. For example, mind-body monism is discernible at this level. But for some reason, mind-body dualism never goes away. But there's a metaphysical component associated with mind-body dualism that is extrapolative in nature from out of the same perspective you use to maintain a scientific perspective, right? In gaining access to both of these levels of knowledge into the metaphysics, but also a sure understanding of the physical, right? The physics of the world. You become pinnacle, or you become peak experienced, okay? And there's a certain amount of euphoria associated with that. It's natural in life, euphoria, just the right amount of it counteracts depression in life. It's satisfying somehow, this euphoria. But it's not so deeply marked as the euphoria associated with something destructive, like arson, for example. You're becoming an arsonist in your practices in life, and you're developing a euphoria for that along those lines. It's not that much different from the euphoria of sports achievement, but somehow it's dark and seductive, right, in comparison, compared with motivational degrees of euphoria experienced in sports competition and victory related to that, or successfully learning a skill. There's a certain amount of euphoria associated with that motivates in practical terms of value, whereas arson does not do so, or you could argue is very severely limited in any value that it actually expresses in the world. Organized crime being the perspective you use to derive value from something like arson, right? So the Sphinx is focused on that borderland between the metaphysics and the physics, right? In studying, right? But he's getting his eyeballs right up into the metaphysics because this is, occultism, where you're trying to gain access to the hidden, right? Gemini is largely hidden, though it is conceptualized as a pure expression of illumination, about as pure an expression of illumination as you can get. And that is also considered to be functional in accordance with its own collective properties that you might call a nature, if you could experience it as a nature, right? Our experience of it, though, is indirect and is experienced in nature and through our perception, which is where we experience everything, including sensation, right? The brain is where all of this happens. You experience everything, even in your body, through the way your brain responds to physiological nervous impulse, right? From out of the sense receptors and through the nerves, the peripheral nervous system, impacting or influencing very directly your central nervous system, which you could think of overall as your brain, to include your spinal cord, right? But the cerebral cortex is where the consciously accessible activity tends to take place, especially towards the front of your brain, where you've got a frontal cortex where, planning takes place, goal orientation takes place, various forms of, organization in life take place, right? To include accessing, your visionary capabilities, right? Which, derive quite a bit from all the rest of your brain, which is very active and functional on a preconscious to unconscious level in Freudian terminology, right? His version of preconscious being, associated with the way the brain normally works and its associations and its automaticity, right? Whereas his version of unconscious tends to emphasize clinical considerations of dysfunction quite often, but also comparative health, right? Now, the Sphinx has developed its capacities in the face of challenges, right? That you would call stormy challenges. There's kind of a storm situation going on there. It's no accident that a group like the neo-Nazis refer to some of their platforms as things like Stormfront. Okay, neo-Nazism is designed to confuse and perplex people and cause emotional reactivity, not only amongst neo-Nazis, but also amongst people that are more communistically bent, right? So you get controlled opposition out of it, just as sure as you get controlled opposition out of the communistic left, right? They're designed to be in controlled opposition with one another. So these are Capricorn considerations, but the Sphinx is very seriously learned compared with the other animal figures, right? This is a learned animal. It has retired itself to an understanding that you would call pinnacle understanding or peak experience. It is in a relative state of rest compared with these other two figures that are very actively involved. One of them is very obviously confused, and the other one's very obviously climbing that ladder, making progress, whereas the other one is only just on the verge of starting to make progress. The head, right? The croc head is about to change directions from a lack of progress or a lost progress towards serious progress. And of course, the Sphinx has achieved the blue up there, right? Which symbolizes royal status, comparatively speaking, banking status. The Sphinx got a savings account and a checking account. He's got $7,000 in each, and he's fast, moving towards a $70,000 savings account. In which case he's planning on maybe investing some of that money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, monkey boy here is just trying to get through his classes every day. He's stressed. He's absorbing the stress successfully, though, so he's climbing that ladder. Those lightning bolts are not, dissuading him too much. It's something he has to learn to contend with. He's got to learn efficiently as well as effectively. There's no time for plodding along when you're in college, right? You have got to figure out how to study effectively. And if you make a mistake along those lines, you could find yourself out of school because you're not making the grade, right? So these lightning bolts, which stem from the stars, symbolizing specific subjects, right? You might call them royal subjects because they're out of the blue up there, right? Challenges that come at you out of the blue, like concepts that you got to master. You got lightning bolts going back and forth between, Aries oblivion at the bottom of the card. These lightning bolts arise phallically from someplace perplexing. It could be up high, it could be down low. But it's Capricorn. It's a state of conflict and confusion, right? Propaganda will put you in that state if you're not careful. So always be wary of the presence of propaganda. And it comes from all sides, propaganda. It's not just the Nazis, it's the communists, and it's also banking. A specific album cover, the Scorpions Best of Volume 2 or something like that. You got like a ring with a scorpion on it, and a woman's hand up there is like a claw. And, it's almost like perch itself at the top of a waterfall, and those claws, those red nails, point downward, right? That's the same idea as all these stars lined up there, right? These are like Leo lion figures hanging around the house with the Sphinx figure, which is kind of the 33rd degree Mason figure, right? The honorary figure that does a lot of really good, quick thinking. And they're all, harmonizing with his way of going about doing things, right? Well, they provide challenges, claws, red painted or whatever, to the climbers of the world, right? And they're basically just challenges to be overcome. You keep yourself tempered in the face of them and true. You're after the truth. You're not after some belief, lie-based belief to maintain. That would be inefficient. That would be purely Capricorn to a destructive degree. That would mean you're merely woke rather than fully and productively awake in life. Now, the Sphinx up there is fully awake as a human being. It's access two levels of knowledge together for what you might call pinnacle or magical experience, right? Now, over in the Chariot, this is worn as a suit of armor. And let's say we conceptualize this armor instead of being honorary brass, which would be more of a practical parade consideration, where you consider this presentation to be that of a parade float where somebody is featured on the float who has achieved status of some kind or another, maybe the mayor or somebody like that. It takes on funerary properties as soon as you think of this suit of armor as gold itself, real gold, which is very dense and therefore massive, therefore heavy, right? It's a state of relative rest expressed here, but it's a functional expression. It's a unit. It's a collective unity at a state of disciplined rest. So meditation is taking place here, and specifically meditation upon the body, feeling the sensation of your body and relaxing all your muscles prior to going to sleep or whatever, while at the same time maybe visually observing the ceiling of your room and the surrounding features, or maybe you're just imagining it with your eyes closed, symbolized by the visor brought down, symbolizing your eyelids are closed. But you have the capacity to also open them and see what's going on around you. But your eyebrows are going to close, or your eyelids are going to close at some point, right? Prior to going to sleep. And hopefully hopefully you've enhanced your dreams through this process to be more lucid or absolved and useful somehow, indicating, to you as you wake up in the morning and remember your dreams, what your true underlying nature really is, as would be symbolized by the fortune card as the card behind the chariot in the stack of Cancer symbolic trump cards. As these trump cards are on the top of the card stacks all through the tree as pinnacle expressions, typically one expression to the world, one expression more contextual, except at the bottom of the Secret Tree of Alchemy, where the expressions in the world and the underlying nature are one together, right? The devil over in Capricorn tends to be, even though, you become perplexed looking at that imagery, trying to figure out, such things as intent on the part of that goat figure, right? That plays the devil, the demonized figure, or maybe demonic figure, right? You're not really quite sure. But that's an obvious presentation that expresses both presentation of the world and context at one time. And of course, you got the Devil's Tower in the background there, which is a volcanic symbolism typical of Crowley's cards, but also a mountain climbing symbolism, which he likes to use in his card, which are expressed here in the trump cards fairly often, right? There's preparing for that mountain climb, and then there's the pinnacle experience of it. So then the fortune becomes past experiential as a collectivity and a collective unity or a universe, right? Whereas presently you're prepping for another mountain climb, which you'll express over in Leo stack in the form of lust and the universe, with the universe as context for lust. And lust is something you keep tempered out in the real world, or else you might find yourself caught up in conflicts similar to what Elijah Crowley himself got caught up in and a certain failed expedition, right? So he expressed a lack of temperance himself, and others did during the climb, right? The lust factor, which he exemplified maybe deliberately, taking advantage of something that was going on with the rest of the crew where this was not going to be a successful climb, so he decided to play the devil. And I'll let you look into the specifics of that yourself, right? So this is all about baseline temperance practiced here in Cancer. These meditations are baselines for life. You got your past studies as your built-up fortune here, and you got your present preps as expressive of that built-up fortune, where you're prepared to go out into the world, learning new disciplines all the time, but keeping relatively underdeveloped disciplines to the, to heal or in check and rather polished, right? Not polished the same way as those sapphires on that gold sarcophagus, you might say, right? Just like with King Tut, all that heavy polished gold, painted and polished with the acids and oils of maybe womanly hands polishing it up into a really bright expression of gold until somebody modern decided to polish the gold and kind of dull it up a little bit. But this is a funerary expression once you are actually wearing gold and sapphires together, real gold. It's too heavy to wear for practical purposes other than as jewelry, right? Which is an honorary presentation of a sort, reflective of relative retired status, not unlike that of a royal family, right? You got a gold ring. So you wear it proudly to a degree, but sensibly tempered degree, right? The pride being something you temper, understanding that pride never really disappears from reality, all right? You're wise, kind of like the snake without being a complete snake yourself, right? The serpent, I should say, which is expressed here in the croc figure in Fortune as the back end of that particular creature, right? The tail is expressing certain ideas in these two figures down here. The tail of the monkey is a little bit more radical looking in a practical sense, in the sense that maybe it understands some physics by now, whereas the tail of the croc figure keeps it hung up, right, on the wheel. It's kind of dragging it back. It's trying to progress forward. It's on the verge, though, of making real progress as soon as that wheel turns a certain way for him, or he has to relinquish being hung up, basically. You notice the monkey tail, okay, the well-attired monkey tail is not attached to the wheel so much, right, but represents something spiritual or ideal, ideational even, that's true in nature, and it's expressed in a tempered fashion, comparatively speaking. That monkey is looking, gazing in a manner not unlike the Sphinx is gazing up towards the metaphysics while grasping the physics, right? The wheel, the planet, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe, right? And reaching up into conceptually or spiritually that which you would call the metaphysics. So this then is almost like, study becomes like the symbolic act of prayer. Now, in ancient times, like in ancient Sumeria, prayer was practiced in symbolic terms, born of practical kinds of practices, where if you get into orgone biophysics at all, you find yourself expressing yourself this way and discerning the condition of the situation, orgone biophysically, maybe suspecting that a cloudbuster is in operation nearby. The idea is you basically extend your hands out in the air and up into the air, maybe with your fingers kind of open, to feel the energy and the atmosphere, which might be charged a specific way, in a sense of being overcharged the way cloudbusters overcharge an atmosphere, right? So the ancient Sumerians used to conduct prayer, ritualistic prayer, using this W shape with their arms extended out, kind of up in the air, and a W, of course, symbolizes Gemini in the secret tree of alchemy. It's born of a practice that people have practiced in the ancient past. Prayer, of course, is in our time, since the ziggurat times of ancient Sumeria, right? Where rituals were conducted in those muddy ziggurat places with the dolls in there, the wooden dolls, and all kinds of interesting mental processes were explored back then. Maybe eventually along destructive cultic lines to a degree, or maybe just kind of getting into compulsory cultism to the degree ancient Sumeria got itself involved along those lines. Now it's basically the bringing together of the palms. So we have a symbolism involved more extensively with metaphysical considerations here, but there are still some practical considerations, but they're more conceptually oriented, not so much based on a gesture of practical utility, okay, because prayer gesturing is impractical for practically anything but a symbolic presentation, right? But the symbolism, being an analogy expression typically, touches base. It has a capacity for touching base, in abstract terms with both the metaphysical and the physical, right? Makes it rather peak experiential in orientation. So you're symbolizing a kind of peak experience, believe it or not. Typically expressed towards the end of the day, prior to bed, you say a prayer. Prayer could be very dangerous, though, if you're part of a compulsory cult at all, where specific prayers are compulsory. I'll leave that there. For example, certain kinds of forgiveness are a little more than providing upfront forgiveness to organized criminals that plan on robbing you blind through the cult. But I'll leave that there too. So, this bringing of the hands together symbolizes a lot of ideation. It's not that much different from what goes on with the symbolism associated with something like a swastika. because the swastika touches base with both inactive and active providence and related initiations drawn out of, as far as, deriving force is concerned, from initiatives previously established. Okay. Fortune then represents here an initiative previously established that allows the chariot to present itself a certain way, right? Okay, you might say the chariot here is a really good presenter. All right. So it is, in many respects, retired from having to learn so many of the really hard lessons in life that you had to come up through Knox-wise, right, to get through school and all that, and, maybe develop tenure. So you got a funerary aspect to that here. So you could argue, bedtime prayer is like a funeral. It's funerary in many respects, right? You're trying to be as golden as you can possibly be when you are engaged in prayer. It's the ending of your conscious day, as far as labor is concerned. The final labor of the day, except maybe the meditation you use when you're in bed, going to sleep. So, you got two flat surfaces brought together that can symbolize two universes brought together in Gemini, which symbolizes, associations, right, that produce closure, the bringing together of the two hands. The two universes come together in closure. But the flatness of the hands can symbolize Cancer or Aries even, since this is an intelligence symbolism, right? Intelligence symbolism tends to emphasize either Gemini and or Virgo, right? Or if it's seriously intelligent, it depends on what kind of expression of intelligence we're talking about. If it's peak experiential, it's Virgo, which is an expression out of Sagittarius, right? The golden road of Sagittarius. The shadows down there of Capricorn proportions with that golden road. The shadows encountered, the looming figures encountered, right? And then prevailed over in life towards pinnacle experience. So prayer would represent kind of a pinnacle experience on the given day, right? At least bedtime prayer would be like that. So the flatness of the hands brought together can symbolize Aries ideation, in the sense that you are talking to that aspect of God which senses all, right? Idealistically speaking. You can't prove that, by the way. Nothing practical senses all, but you can emulate the idea, the ideation of it towards some useful end. It probably eventually provides diminishing returns relative to effort, right? As far as being, sensibly aware of what's going on around you day to day versus lost in the clouds, as though your senses are located in a whole other universe or something, right? Daydreaming, whatever. So you can practice certain things to make yourself day to day more presently aware of what's going on around you, right? And then save the time for your head to be up in the clouds, lost somewhere, for when you're in the safe space at home, right? And then you can fantasize more. Maybe during specific times, fixing dinner or whatever. So the Sphinx is very clearly grounded. Same as the chariot figure here, the knight, grounded. It's a prince figure, really. The prince on a self-orientation level is earth elemental. I think the associations in tradition of associating him with the air element tends to be kind of a veil or a blind to the effect that the prince maintains a relationship with a quote-unquote girlfriend or princess somewhere, right? That's air elemental on a self-orientation level at the very least. You can look at the tarot cards, the princess is all in the air and the prince is all comparatively on the ground, right? even in the air elemental sword version of your typical prince card. So the prince occupies an intelligence vehicle, same as what's going on here with these two cards. So this is a prince expression. It's kind of a knight expression too. The reason that's the case, which is more of an adult orientation comparatively speaking, is because Aries is so impractical that no mortal man can achieve it. And no mortal woman can achieve it either, although she might ideate along those lines to the detriment of self, mostly to the effect that no man is good enough for her, compared with this Aries ideal, which doesn't exist in practical reality, right? So this particular card is particularly, you could argue, masculine, but that doesn't mean that it's inaccessible to women or anything like that. It just means polarity is expressed here in the deck, in the different branches of the tree, right? Relative to other branches. That's all it is. Polar symbolism at work. Yeah, but feminist ideas will show up in all the images of all the cards somehow. Feminine ideas, you could say. Breasts on the Sphinx, maybe, kind of shielded there or armored over. And Cancer still expressing active providence from out of Gemini, not only in its own nature, but as its own form of established initiative, which Leo draws from, to initiate from the perspective of automaticity, Leo, but also atomically in producing the function of the atom, which is a Virgo analogy, right? Whereas molecular considerations are Sagittarius considerations, where all the chemical reactions actually take place, but nuclear explosions, or atomic explosions, I should say, are highly expressive of Virgo and Capricorn and Leo, somehow producing something equivalent to a Big Bang, which you could think of as a Gemini analogy, as, the Gemini perspective is like ongoing, quote-unquote, Big Bang, in the sense that purely intensive illumination is functioning there, out of which universes are born. And what sparks a Big Bang but Taurus, the divine spark archetype, okay? So, yeah, Big Bang does have its place in the secret tree of alchemy as a consideration, and maybe if there's a literal Big Bang associated with the creation of a universe, it's not only a Gemini perspective, but a practical level perspective of both Virgo and Sagittarius consideration, or beast encountered consideration, 666. You could think of Pisces low as 666 in a self-orientation sense, as you as an individual are an expression of beastly orientation, whereas so is reality in oriented itself as a challenge to be overcome, right? It is beastly and dangerous. 666. Numerologically speaking, expressive of Gemini, Virgo, and Sagittarius ideation. Ultimately, even Pisces as, the number 12, the divine number 12, or spiritually empowered number 12, I should say. The 12th sign, or the 12th process, or the 12th step in the explication of a complete reality as its own universe, or its own collective unity or unit operating in nature, okay? Every individual is a universe, or every conscious individual is certainly a universe all its own. There's conscious expression taking place in these two cards, right? So we also have ritual here of funerary scale or honorary scale taking place in these cards. Okay. The professor has to worry about becoming hapless in his or her status achieved unless studies are maintained and practical expression of that knowledge, acquired, is secured in the real world to the benefit of both self and others. You're maintaining your scope of field practice, you might say, in teaching, for example, or professional expressions of some kind or another, right? You're not becoming hapless and detached from reality and warped in your metaphysical orientations, even to the point where you're becoming compulsory destructive towards other people and emotionally reactive as a result, and basically becoming more and more abusive of people, neurotically expressing yourself towards, you could argue, a neurotic reincarnation in a future lifetime where you got to sort out all those tendencies, even though maybe in the previous lifetime you lucked out and were not neurotic from out of early childhood, right? And infancy. But made yourself rather neurotic as you got older and grumpier and emotionally reactive towards people and domineering towards people, right? Rather than merely superior in an Adlerian sense of the word. Okay, the Sphinx here is clearly superior. It has achieved superiority in the face of inferiority, right? Inferiority is experienced in climbing that Wheel of Fortune ladder, right? You're going from being inferior as the croc down there on the bottom towards superior as the Sphinx up top. But that doesn't mean you're a domineering kind of person. There is a certain degree of appropriate manner associated with, I am not yet your friend in life. When you're something like, say, a university professor, there's a certain amount of professional style that comes with it, maybe expressed in what is worn to class every day, right? It's different from what you'd expect from a student, so it kind of sets you off as kind of separate from the student, but you're accessible to the student through appropriate channels that are described in the syllabus or whatever. So yeah, you're set apart to a degree, an appropriate degree that's beneficial on a productive level to what is going on with teaching courses at a high school or a university, right? So back to the prayer. You're not only praying to what you would call God, per se, or a God, or the God, or the entire top half of the secret tree of alchemy, including down into Virgo, or down into Libra, is what you might call God, per se. But there's all different kinds of aspects to this God consideration, including that which you would call devil, which is Capricorn down at the bottom of the tree, right? So as I've described before, between universes there is this area where on a conceptual level, things get kind of confused, right? We don't know exactly what the border of a given universe, say outer space, actually looks like or how it expresses itself. We've conceptualized it, but that's like high metaphysics to a degree as a consideration goes, until you get into the mathematics that would bring you down into the theory associated with physics, right? Including quantum physics and related technological developments into nuclear physics, right? Where engineers come to bear on these things pretty heavily. So, yeah, that confusion, right, that comes over the mind. I can't imagine the finite limits of our universe. I become perplexed and lost, right? And I got to you take a break from it for a while, you know. It's almost can become depressing, you might argue, right? The challenge of it. That's Capricorn, right? Capricorn is right between those two hands brought together, symbolically speaking, just assuredly as gods are brought together, or universes are brought together, right? Or gods are communicated with in a Pisces high sense of the word, where you would conceptualize a given god existing somewhere spiritually as a spirit, disembodied maybe, right? As far as your perspective is concerned. Down there in Pisces low, where the body, the biological body, is symbolically expressed, right? Or the body is expressed in biological terms, I should say. So then you get into Gemini, which is active providence of infinite scope. Functionally speaking, you could conceive of that as God, the thing that brings together in active providential terms, right? Versus the inactive providential terms of Aries, which also contributes to the integrity of every universe, right? Though inactively. And then you got the initiation over there in Taurus taking place, that somehow it integrifies, you know, our reality, its activity. It relates things with other things, right? And it expresses itself as an initiation along those lines, an application of force, of specifying nature, though it doesn't become specific until it's down in Sagittarius land to be perceived, or at least as far down as Libra, to be perceived on an emotional level, emphasizing Libra, but still it's Sagittarius centered, the consideration, right? The experience of it, the perception being assigned, categorically speaking, to Sagittarius, right? As an analogy, as an idea, relating to other ideas. But specific placement, for example, takes place in relative terms down in Sagittarius, where Gemini, the same kind of relations exist, you could argue, but in unspecified terms, because you can't specify those terms. You might conceptualize them in a manner similar to how holography is expressed as a theoretical orientation and as a scientific orientation, right? But we don't know for sure exactly what's going on up there in the metaphysical realms of consideration, which are just, for us, realms of consideration, and they're best considered in systematic terms and in extrapolated terms and in terms that are not emotionally reactive. But at the same time, you're also praying to the devil. The devil is there too, so to speak, in the form of Capricorn, that confusion, right? It affects a fence, a barrier. Okay, barriers are typically assigned to Capricorn as analogies go. Okay? So there's no praying to God without also praying to the devil. But you can relax a little bit about the devil as long as you're not drawing such dissonance into your universe or the universe around you, right, through your behavior. For example, you decided you wanted to become an arsonist. You could argue you're drawing dissonance of root, fundamental consideration in the world as what is termed in what became a religious concept drawn out of philosophy as original sin. When the universes are all created, there is not only field harmony, but there is dissonance associated with that process. Now, do you want to bring more dissonance into your situation, or do you want to leave the dissonance to some other reality, at least to the degree that, you know, what dissonance there is in your reality can be dealt with productively and usefully to survive and thrive, right? The planet is healthy and clean. You are healthy and clean. Therefore, your universe is healthy and clean, right? Now, you can take this to an idealistic extreme, the way some compulsory destructive religions do, to the point where your natural sexual development is forced into a suppressed and then repressed state of affairs in favor of supporting the preferred compulsory destructive cults and related state that cult supports, right? People have not cured themselves from this tendency, despite the results of the 2024 U.S. elections, right? We're finding out that the conservatives express their own degree of cultural suppression in the world and are keen upon reintroducing it through this recent election, right? So they're starting to reveal their true colors of late, to a degree. Not a degree to the point where I'm ready to bring my own version of the hammer down on it, but I'm watching things closely along those lines. So this symbolic prayer action of bringing the two flat palms of the hands together symbolize basically communicating into the metaphysics to bring about a synchronicity in life that favors life on practical terms, right? Synchronicity is something that people can clue into experientially, but scientifically speaking, you just can't prove it. So it's considered to be largely a metaphysical concept, but though you can tune into it experientially to a degree, you can kind of discern its occurrence in life, but you can't. It's something every individual has to experience for themselves. And until that's taken place, it really isn't proven to exist to anyone. A scientific experiment hasn't wrapped itself around synchronicity as of yet. Might take place to a degree, maybe in degrees and stages at some point in the future. But science has tried to get up into borderline metaphysical considerations in the past very expensively, as science, relatively speaking, tends to be compared with, say, philosophy, which, comparatively speaking, can be very cheap. Though your average philosopher would state unequivocally to be a quality philosopher, you are investing very heavily in your studies and your considerations in life, right? So that's a relative expression of terminology on my part, this relativity I'm expressing here, where science, somehow relatively speaking, is expensive, but the huge architectural considerations in trying to prove the existence of a cosmic ether, for example, did not produce conclusive results. Okay. Some would argue they didn't prove anything, even inconclusivity. So I haven't read deeply into that. So these cards also are expressive of what you might call resilience in its relatively at-rest form, you might say, call it a form. There's momentum expressed in these cards in relative expression of stasis, but something in the background is very active. The splashing about going on with fortune there corresponds symbolically, cross-referencing wise, with the light, the white in the background of the chariot, right? It's bright back there. Or in the fortune card, it's very, movement-oriented back there. Like 10, symbolic of the number 10 somehow, which is kind of a practical Gemini consideration, but also a spiritually empowered Capricorn consideration, numerologically speaking. For Gemini, it captures the idea of the power of multiplication, where you can 10 things, right? You can make them 10 times more through Gemini, just like that. The mystery of it somehow at work, multiplying things amongst the universes, supposedly ever expanding, but already of infinite scope, which is kind of a paradox of sort, of a functional nature in Gemini, right? Results in dichotomous thinking when you get confused over the issue, which can channel into controlled opposition and related emotional reactivity of a reactionary nature, according to certain philosophers and scientists of the past. Wilhelm Reich being, in my view, chief amongst those. on practical grounds, and grounds that can be considered with the least amount of harm, right? So this momentum expressed here could be symbolically representative of the concept of resilience, baseline health, baseline momentums that are of integritous nature, unified together on a collective level, of specific nature or strongly specifying nature at the very least, right? Cancer still being in touch with the concepts of, the infinite, right? That reach up into the metaphysical can cause perplexion in practical terms, right? Down at Capricorn, perplexion, conflict, toxicity, confusion, wokeness, being semi-awake only and emotionally reactive as a result. Threatened, you might say. Aquarius and Capricorn can both be threatened rather easily, each from their own unique perspectives. Aquarius from the perspective of being expressive of laboring nature, consciously laboring nature at that, right? Relative weaknesses expressed from that perspective in life, but also relative strengths in the sense that you can be very novel down at the bottom of the secret tree of alchemy compared with up high, where everything is more expressive of what you might call old school, or the Sphinx up there at the top of the wheel, right? That's old school. Same as that crab on the top of the armor in Chariot, right? That's how, it's an old school expression of the armored presentation happening just to the south, right? When you go to learn from a professor, you're learning from somebody experienced pretty extensively in what you might call old school. And one of the things that professors typically look for is how younger generations coming up through the school are going to express things in the world in novel terms, right? What kind of new knowledge are they going to bring into this system that we call a university as alumni, right? When they go out in the world, they bring prestige and honors to the university. So it's important, too, to remember that the prayer stance as used in modern times with the religion today is also rather phallic in the sense that it's Capricorn, right? Sexual behaviors tend to be very carefully designed into nature to be somewhat sadomasochistic along worshipful lines, right? So you got to be careful with that and appropriately tempering it into your relationships so that you don't become destructively expressive or toxically expressive of sadomasochism in life, right? For example, young people are protected from these considerations so that they are not exploited sexually by priests or whatever. That's an important consideration here because this symbolism falls right in line with certain practices long associated with human sexuality, all right? That, in cultic destructive circles are considered to be taboo, though they're perfectly natural expressions that people naturally engage in, even worshipfully and in a rather somewhat masochistic sense, right? Prayer posturing is particularly associated with Christianity, which, in my view, conditions people excessively towards masochism compared with the other Abrahamic religions. The mafia-ism of Judaism, for example, or the sadism, comparatively speaking, of the Muslim religion, which is rather, shall we say, even phallically sadistic, which is a conditioning that influences the women, masochistic though they may be to an excessive degree under Islam. They can't help but be conditioned through the father of the family along sadistic lines. So that's its own can of worms. each one of those religions, to include communism, is its own can of worms along these lines that we call sadomasochistic considerations, right? So you find a lot of this symbolism in movies, especially horror movies, which are particularly marked with various expressions of sadomasochism, right? You have to be careful with these media genres so that, their influence on your life is tempered into lessons of value, right? You don't become psychopathically sadomasochistic through your studies of any kind, to include if you happen to be studying horror movies for some reason or another, right? So you can listen to, for example, rock music without suffering any harm from it. Okay, it doesn't automatically program into you the devil per se, all right? Even heavy metal. But rock music does emphasize Capricorn compared with classical music, which emphasizes Cancer, right? The music of the universes and the universe expressed strongly through classical music. Rock being an extension of that down the secret tree of alchemy into Capricorn, if it's effective music, right? Some heavy metal music, for example, gets lost in a bunch of cacophony that you could call useless noise, right? People get into it just to fit into a culture, right? And they couldn't possibly be, in my view, into it as music, but it has to do with the simian nature of people in regards fitting in. Unfortunately, sadomasochism is mixed up into that orientation quite a bit. Even for, Monkey Boy here in The Fortune and Croc Boy or Girls or whatever. Croc is particularly expressive of rock and roll heavy metal. To the degree where it might be thoroughly unproductive as music, and doesn't really have any swing, and the voices are all contrived to sound, like demons or whatever. And it kind of just, doesn't sit well on a purely musical level, but is part of a culture of fit-inness that you could call cultism all its own, which, can easily take on sadomasochistic properties of compulsory destructive cultic dimension, right? For example, the neo-Nazis have their own, shall we say, dissonant music forms that they prefer, and they kind of listen to it just to fit in with the cultic aspects of what they're caught up into, right? You see it in a movie like Green Room, where the music is lacking in certain qualities, right, that you would call universal and natures, universally natural, okay? It's more specific to what amounts to a compulsory destructive cultism, right? Where we isolate ourselves around this cultural expression of relative dissonance, right? The whole concept of soul music, for example, emphasizing Cancer, it's kind of relaxed and laid back, and then it gets into the sexual beats of Libra, kind of out of that perspective, compared with something like heavy metal rock, which seems to be, just like the lightning bolts in The Fortune here. It's born of on-high banking out of those stars, but also born out of the ground somehow, statically speaking. It becomes a storm front of a sort, you might say. And the automatic responses to it are, questionable at the very least, that this kind of dissonant music. There's got to be something Libra and Cancer channeling through it for it to really strike home with people as music, the way, the rock music industry has. So I don't consider, the most problematic aspect of rock music to me consists of lyrics more than anything, which can be very much, encrypted into secret codes of a sort relating to events like JSK that I've discussed, where he was turned into a blackmail porn star as an infant out of Hamburg, Germany, and Hollywood and San Francisco in the late 60s. Caught up with blackmail pornography, control over what amount to media-centered intelligence operatives and operations, right? Where JSK was actually made to witness murders taking place. People essentially being snuffed by the network for whatever reason. Ritualistically, okay? Really dark magic, right? Being brought to bear on an infant. Conditioning-wise, right? So, experience of one kind or another amounts to different forms of buried gold, right? So the music industry works in accordance with those principles too. There's certain kinds of buried gold that are down low in the card, right? It's like heavy metal, right? Is down there on the bottom of the card, kind of dark, but it's gold down there. Then you got gold that's higher up in the card, right? That's more like classical, old school, right? Music of the spheres kind of a deal going on there. It's easily related to, especially when you get older, you just find yourself kind of harmonizing along and resonating rather pleasantly with some classical music that comes up, even as muzak at the food court or whatever, right? You find yourself kind of relating to it, right? Because it's good for older people, especially, to listen to that kind of music. They got too much Capricorn in their natures by the time they're getting old anyway, right? So the knight here is buried gold, so to speak. Old school of the past, the illustrious past, yes, but the past nonetheless, kind of buried funerary like in a tomb or crypt somewhere. And yet this thing is alive and meditating, right? So those sites are very often multi-purpose for not only ritualistic purposes, but meeting purposes and meditations purposes and teaching purposes, like, the catacombs of the ancient past having been used along these lines for secret meetings, especially. Underworld type stuff where things are definitely deep secret and involve conspiracy, for example. They tend to gravitate to the basement, so to speak, like, over at your local Masonic temple, they like to party in the basement, and we don't know what's going on with those parties necessarily. It's part of the lore of Freemasonry somehow. So we have here buried fortune, the fortune card behind the chariot card, and all the subsequent cards like the aces are buried in there too, right? Like, they're relics, a sword, a cup, a disc, and what else? A torch, long, burned out or waiting to be relit again, right? Relit, like a buried treasure is a flame to be rediscovered, because there was a lot of passion associated with the creation of the art associated with practical or otherwise this entombment, right? This encryption of a sort. So symbolism relates to that very readily, right? It is an encryption. It's a coded encryption pretty automatically, right? So it's also old school. People have been doing this for a very long time. Compared with, matter-of-fact, present-day expressions of linguistic code, taking the form of different forms of notation popular in the present time, very easily and directly understood by people, especially people of related discipline, right? So I guess to cap all of this off, I'll just express the idea again, or emphasize the idea of closure. Okay, you close up the crypt, so to speak, once it's buried there, right? And somehow what's in there is maintained golden, right? As a set, you bury the pharaoh with the set that he carried with him or her through life, right? For survival and thriving purposes. Their hunting gear is typically buried in there with them, right? If you're like King Tut or whatever, Tutankhamun. So it's a set. It's a collective unity encrypted, okay, in relative secrecy. Same way cipher is used to encrypt coded messages, right? And somehow this state of affairs maintains itself successfully for a period of time, maybe 4,000 years, right? Or maybe less, 2,000 years. But it mirrors how your memory matrix maintains itself in closure, in relatively encrypted status, right? Waiting to be accessed by appropriate means in the future, where the treasures are considered and then brought into relative accessibility with the public, as the public views the treasures of King Tut traveling through the United States in 1976, though some person of, lesser knowledge compared with the ancients polished on that gold and made it comparatively dull compared with the way it looked when it was first encountered or accessed. Absolutely shining and superbly polished gold, uncovered as the tomb was, accessed. Okay, so you can, these memories or these experiences that you would call collectively soul maintain themselves in relative accessibility for a limited period of time, but a long period of time. Okay, there is resilience expressed here. And with that, I'll let you go. Thank you.